Welcome to Growing and Aging Sex Positive.
Or gasp.
Get ready to grow with us as we discuss all things sex and sexuality related.
I'm Nina.
And I'm Cari.
And today we are talking about sex-positive parenting, where we are a sex-positive podcast and we are parents. So how do these two things go together?
And folks, we want to hear from you. What is on your mind? What questions or thoughts do you have about sex and sexuality? We will share questions and replies in a future episode. Write to us at gasppod@gmail.com. That's GAASPPOD@gmail.com. First, we want to thank our sponsor, Oak Park Our Whole Lives. Oak Park OWL has classes for kids in 1st, 5th, and 8th grade in the Greater West Side of Chicagoland area. Classes start in September and January each year. For more information, please go to their website at www.opowl.org.
Now let's get into it.
Hi, folks.
Hello.
So we've got another broad topic for you here today. We're going to be talking about sex-positive parenting.
Parenting while being a sex-positive person.
Yeah. So kind of per our usual format, we're going to start off by talking about some of the definitions we found about sex positivity. And then we're going to give you what we have arrived at as our own definition. As with all things human sexuality, there is a lot of opinions. There's some research, but really there's just a lot of opinions. So I think it's important to talk about the context and what our own definitions are before we dive into a topic.
There's so many terms that get used so many different ways when it comes to sex. Yeah.
And I often think that contributes to some societal miscommunication and misunderstanding because we don't pause to talk about what any of these terms mean.
Yeah, we want to do our best to be clear that we're talking about the same thing before we get further into asking questions about it.
For sure. So I did a little bit of research. I looked at some stuff from the APA, so that's the American Physician, and then I looked at a couple of other groups and blogs and education, like websites that do sex education for young people. And then I also hit on a bunch of Psychology Today articles, that kind of thing. And I'll just read some of the key bullet points that came up for me, paraphrased in my own words. So key elements of sex positivity are views sexuality as a potentially positive part of the human experience and a healthy part of human development throughout the lifespan. And I do mean birth to death as the lifespan. And we'll talk a little more about that later. Striving to center connection over shame and honoring individual experiences and preferences. And then when we're researching the definition of sex positive, it's super important to me that we talk about what it is not. So these are all things that most of these sources would agree does not represent sex positivity. So promoting certain sex acts. So for example, being sex positive does not mean you promote promiscuity, although that word is complicated in and of itself. It's not about diminishing or downplaying differences in personal or cultural ideas of sex or ever ignoring harm that's caused by sex. So it isn't saying that all sex is healthy sex and sexual contact is always okay, right? That is not included in sex positivity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gets used in this pejorative way sometimes, like to maybe in even a sleazy way.
Yeah.
If you are sex positive, what that really means is that you're ready all the time, anytime, which is not necessarily true, right? And yeah, it's not devaluing sex either, right? Which is what I hear in this description of these Reddit uses of the term that you're describing, that if someone says they're sex positive, then that means that sex is just like getting a cup of coffee or something. And it's different. And that's not what the term means.
Yeah, and you just made me think that some of the like negative feedback that I sometimes feel I receive as a parent who would describe herself as sex positive as a parent is that I don't have boundaries about what I'll discuss with my child. Being open and having like open dialogue with my child doesn't mean that all topics are on the table, right? It's still developmentally appropriate.
You are very careful about these things, Cari.
Yeah, I try really hard to not be boundaryless and very explicitly decide what I'm comfortable sharing and what I think needs to happen later or is something my child should maybe not necessarily research at this age, but should think about on her own or that's private for her. So we had a lot of words there from other sources. And then I thought, Nina, you and I could just discuss what sex positivity and sex positive parenting means to us as individuals.
Yeah.
So this is the definition that I arrived at, and I'm just going to read it to you. I think of it as a mindset and a lens to view the world. Since sexuality to me is very expansive, exploring my own views on bodies, identity, sexuality, and reproduction is a constant, lifelong journey. It's not a destination I'm ever going to arrive at where I say I've got all the information, but it's like a tool that I have that I move through all of my relationships, politics, and parenting with. And the two phrases that kept coming up that resonate really hard for me are shame-free and pleasure positive. In fact, I prefer the term pleasure positive over sex positive because I think it's really the core of what I feel often our society doesn't do a good job of giving young people is the overarching thing is that I would like your life to feel good. And that includes however you understand and participate in your own sexuality. I'd like pleasure to be really central to that. That's important to me.
Yeah. I really like those, Cari. And there's so many strong messages of shame, and so many people have so much shame around sexuality that it's worth bringing up as well. But yes, I also like to try to center health and pleasure when it comes to thinking about sex and sharing with my kids about sex. This can be a joyful part of life. It is a way of exploring or expressing connection with other people. It's one way, right? And what is better in life than connection?
Yeah.
Connection is one of the biggest, most powerful experiences that we can have as humans, I think.
And one of the things that I like about what you just said is you were careful to like really make sure to say it's one of the ways, right? It's not the only way that one can express themselves, not the only way to connect romantically, but it's part of your whole being, right? Like it's a single aspect of humanity.
Absolutely. That's not what sex positivity is about to me, but it is a joyful form of connection.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you said it's not an imperative. I think often you touched on this before, the kind of creep factor or the ickiness where people are like, they're really into sex is not necessarily what I would view the idea of sex positivity. It's not prioritizing sex over other things or being unhealthily hyper-focused on sexuality or sex.
And when I think about sex positive parenting specifically, I think about a way of sharing or communicating about sexuality that doesn't center fear.
Risk.
Yes. Yeah. All the scary things, which are also there, right? And need to be communicated. But there are ways to do that that are more focused on health and connection than on the bad things that might happen.
Yeah. I also noticed that we haven't talked really about reproduction, which I think is slightly intentional. So you talked about health, and I think a lot of parenting around sex and sexuality by necessity in our culture is often hyper-focused on reproduction, right? We think about the stereotypical birds and bees talk, that you have a one-off conversation to make sure your kid knows how babies are made. That's the core focus. And that's it. That's all there is to it. which is such a narrow view on sexuality.
It is. And I can't stress enough how terrifying that can be for young people sometimes.
Yeah.
I've heard from both teens and adults reflecting on their own sexuality education. The number one message that they received was, don't get pregnant, don't get someone else pregnant.
Yeah, I think both of those messages are super scary. And I've also heard from adults that have reached adulthood and then had reproductive challenges as an adult that there's also like a falseness to the conversation just about how reproduction happens in general. Mm-hmm. And so on either end of the spectrum, there's a lot of shame. And if you're a good person, when you want to have a baby, it'll be easy for you. And then if you're doing everything right, you'll never get pregnant when you don't want to be or impregnate someone. And I think those messages are often very oversimplified and really scary for young people.
It really speaks to the power and significance of sexuality in our lives, that a message like that can be so scary and affect so many choices that you make in life.
Yeah.
And what that says to me is, no surprise, it needs to be talked about more.
Yeah.
What other part of our lives do we have something that is this significant and gets talked about this infrequently?
Yeah. And not only infrequently, but often when it is talked about, it's talked about in some of the most hushed, embarrassing, uncomfortable, scary ways.
So kids might get all kinds of messages from a pretty young age thinking about, what is your career path going to be? What kind of college are you going to go to? How are you going to make that happen, right? And getting this from all kinds of people in their lives repeatedly over a number of years. I don't know, 6th grade, 7th grade, they're hearing about the importance of college, whatever, but relatively infrequently hearing about, here are the options, or these are the possibilities of what a sexual life might look like for your future. Here's some planning that you might want to do, and thinking about what you believe is the right thing to do at different ages.
I love that specific example. You talked about different behaviors at different ages. So at the beginning, when we were defining sex positive, I touched on the idea that sexuality is birth to death. I know we talked about that in a previous podcast episode, maybe a couple of them. Do you want to share what that means to you?
Sure. Yeah. So remember that sexuality for us, right, if I may be so bold, I
am a human, Nina. I do identify as human.
Yes.
Yes.
And we are covered in skin.
We are.
It's all over the place.
It really is.
Yes.
It's our largest organ.
And it's part of how we connect to other people throughout our lives.
Yeah.
In many ways, at all stages of life. Newborn babies need to be held, right? They need the skin-to-skin contact. Yeah. It literally regulates heartbeat and breathing.
Not just emotions. It actually keeps them biologically alive, right? It sustains their body and their vital functions. Yeah.
Body temperature.
Yeah.
Yes. And the need for physical touch and contact throughout old age and at the last stages of life as well. So when we think about sexuality in this expansive way as, beings who have bodies, who have skin, who have those bodies have needs, also our relationships are important throughout our lives.
Yeah.
And the ways in which, say, a parent shows affection to a small child are deeply connected, right, to the ways in which that a small child grows up and expects or understands affection in romantic relationships.
Yeah.
Or physical relationships.
I love that you talk about touch as so integral. It also, I think, is important to note that children are like little sponges. They come developmentally ready to absorb information from the world around them, whether it's you're talking about tactile, like through their skin, and also what relationships and what touch they're seeing between their caregivers and their family members and out in the world. They're getting messages about relationships and sex all the time, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And it's really important to know that even if you don't want to talk about sexuality, what you're not saying is still giving these messages to your kids. It's baked into the pie. Parents really are their kids' first sex educators. That's just part of the relationship between parent and child.
If you're not talking about it, then you're sending the message that we don't talk about this. It's not that you're not sending any message.
Yeah.
It's there.
And you're not diminishing or influencing the choices that your child makes by not saying anything about it.
The less you say about it, the louder other influences.
Yeah. Some of those other influences we can talk about when we talk about some conflicts that might come up with your child. I parent a lovely 13-year-old daughter, and I had a conversation with her about what she thinks it means to be a sex-positive family, and she said some very interesting things. So what was interesting is that she will tolerate me asking her that question, folks, and she will answer me without hesitation or embarrassment. She feels if you're talking about it, you need to talk about it all the time. You should talk about it in your daily life and making it like not a big deal. And then she did share that not in the weird way, like basically in her 13-year-old way, it needs to be developmentally appropriate. Like you shouldn't overshare information, but that it really helps to just talk about bodies all the time so that you feel comfortable to talk to your parents about your health. And I was a little surprised that health was a big thing for her. It was important to her that she felt comfortable, and she thinks kids need to be comfortable to talk about their bodies and their health with their parents. And the other thing that she shared is that she likes being given the opportunity to discuss the choices that she's making and to be able to talk about them.
Oh, this is so revolutionary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, like, it makes sense. I want to be able to talk about my opinions too. Right? That's kind of it. So I liked that from her. That was good information for me.
It's a great angle on that age, that stage of development too, is how important it is to listen and how much so many people really want to share what is on their mind.
Yeah.
I love that point about talking about it all the time. I definitely advocate talking about bodies, about sex, sexuality, reproduction from very early ages. And that's a great illustration of one of those reasons, is that the more often you talk about it, the less of a big deal that conversation is.
Yeah. And I can give some really tangible examples because, again, sometimes I think people, since you talked about a lot of our conversations and our own history with sex education, or how maybe our parents or caregivers shared about sex education with us, is often fear-based. I think that fear can hold parents back from starting the discussion. So for me, some of the things that happened in my parenting are really early naming body parts, all body parts, genitals and non-genitals, with the correct English terminology. You don't need to be a medical doctor, and it doesn't have to be perfect. But when you're bathing your child, refer to their genitals by name. Say vulva, say penis, say testicles, say the thing so that they know what that part of their body is called. And start that from birth when you're narrating and speaking about their caregiving. And I think for me, that was easiest when you're physically taking care of their body, right? Like you can call their body parts and explain why you're taking care of those body parts, because it helps destigmatize that those are just as good of a body part as any other body part.
And I'd like to just pause there. And you said it destigmatizes bodies and genitals and body parts. And that's a really great framing for it. You often see another framing, which is that this is important to do because of sexual assault.
Good point.
There's this other framing that says we need to teach our kids the scientific language, because if it ever happens that they get molested or something, which is horrible, that if they can use the scientific language, then that is helpful in the investigation and in other adults understanding exactly what happened to that kid. Now that is absolutely true and valid and important.
But it's scary. As a parent, that's scary. That's a scary mindset so like growing up, even in contexts where my family was very progressive and tried to do a good job of naming body parts. But when I was growing up, anything below the waist, vaguely genital on a femme person was a vagina. The whole thing. I wasn't used to using the word vulva. I was mortified by the word labia. I don't think I knew what a clitoris was. Did they even put that on the anatomy drawings?
That's a whole story, yeah.
So if you're already struggling to find the right words and incorporate that into parenting, I think adding the motivation as I don't want my child to be sexually abused adds a whole extra layer of fear that can make it harder to implement. So I love that you called that out, because if you're bathing your child and you're going down this really dark path that you're really like, oh my God, something terrible could happen, which terrible things do happen in the world. That's a valid fear. But if that's like your framing, I think you're creating yet another hurdle for yourself to like actually say the words. That's scary. It's scary. That's scary to me.
It's a great way to put it.
I do want to honor that there's a space of truth somewhere in there, because it is important that kids know the names of their body parts. And I did do a little bit of research. One of the questions that came up for me when we were planning this podcast is, does sex positive parenting help prevent child abuse? And I tried to research that every way I could. And lo and behold, there's not a lot of direct research about that, for all the reasons. There are some groups doing really great work at what would be like public health prevention of childhood sexual abuse. Johns Hopkins has an institute called MORE, MOORE. So if you're interested, you can look at the work that they do. It's research-based and it's great. And it has very little to do with parenting, which is interesting. But there are a number of studies that show kids who know the correct names for their body parts do have lower incidence of sexual abuse. How that research is gathered is complicated for me. But I would say that I strive to be a parent that my child hopefully could talk to if there was a problem. So I think that's how I reframe that fear.
The good news is that empowering kids protects kids.
Love it. I'm not sure that I'm willing to say I agree that it's the body parts that matter, but I think it is the loving care from a caregiver that creates that foundation. I'm all for lowering barriers and like parents doing the best they can with what they have in the moment and not creating an unreasonable and unrealistic expectation. A lot of us aren't coming into parenting with like super great sexuality education in our backgrounds.
Oh yeah, this is not about perfecting parenting. No.
And wherever you are and whatever age your kid is or kids are, you can start now. There's no,
It's okay.
It's okay.
You're good.
Whoever you are is okay. So we just talked a lot about the like negative messages in the world. And I thought that we could share, Nina, some of the activity that we do. I guess activity is a broad statement. I'll share with our listeners that in our nonprofit, Our Whole Lives, Oak Park, Our Whole Lives, that offers sexuality classes for youth, we have a parent orientation. And one of my favorite things that we do in that parent orientation is invite the parents and caregivers to reflect back on their own sex education. And if they're comfortable, share a little bit about it.
It's really powerful as a parent, I think, to remember what that was like for you and what messages you were receiving about sex, what sources you were hearing from or learning from or not, and to remember what it felt like to be a kid.
Yeah. And we talked a little about this when we were prepping for this episode. I think it would be unrealistic to say that all the messages feelings, thoughts, memories that a parent or caregiver has when they're reflecting about their own life and what messages they got about sexuality, it's unrealistic to say that those will all be good. Right? Is that fair?
I don't know that I know a single adult human being who wants for their child exactly what they experience.
I would be comfortable in saying that is a universally true statement. I think most of us can reflect and say, wow, that wasn't great, or that did me harm. So I think we need to call out that sometimes I have really strong conscious memories, and then sometimes my kid will bring something up that just feels icky to me. It's really okay if you're struggling with anything ranging from mild discomfort to severe shame to I have trauma with a capital T, and that anything that's coming up for you, it's valid. And I guess my suggestion for parents and caregivers in this sex positive parenting journey is that if stuff is coming up that's hard for you to manage or doesn't feel good, you have a right to support. Depending on what comes up for you and where you're at in life, that support might be, wow, I need to go find a therapist. Like I'm realizing I've got a lot happening and I want to talk to a professional. It might also be that like you need to build more community and support and you want to tap other parents because like you're realizing something, you have a dilemma or something's come up and you don't know how to handle it. Any of those resources or whatever you need to take care of yourself is a part of the process.
It's so important, and this is a big part of the motivation for the podcast. You can't say it too many times, I think. We are all people living in this world. This world has a lot of negative messages, negative experiences around sexuality. And parenting is not one of those things where you get to a perfect place before you start it. No. We're all learning as we go and swimming while trailing the lifeboat.
Going under, hoping someone pulls you back up.
It's all happening at the same time. One analogy that I find helpful comes from the fat awareness movement, right? About body positivity and where there are these messages that we want to be body positive, but sometimes that isn't really the achievable expectation for individuals. And sometimes it's better or more realistic to aim for a kind of body neutrality in your parenting or in your messages to yourself. And I think maybe there's a parallel here as well. So if sex positivity doesn't feel achievable for you as a parent, right? If it's hard for you to really communicate joy and pleasure when you are talking with your kid about sex, that is totally understandable. And maybe then a kind of sex neutrality is a better standard or a better objective.
And I'll just put that in even more blunt terms. I, in my own life, have relationships with parents that are my loved ones that have experienced sexual trauma, have big, complicated feelings about sex and sexuality. And to say to them that they should achieve sex positive parenting isn't fair and is probably not where they're at. And they are showing up in their journey. And I think sex neutrality is a much better where they're giving their kids information and working through their own stuff. And that's so valid. I just want to be clear. That's super valid. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that.
Information, loving support, willingness to listen without judgment can do so much good for a growing kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talked about some of the heavier stuff. We'll pivot. Go ahead.
What about, I just didn't want to leave this territory yet. What about people or families where a parent and a child are disagreeing in some way?
I love that.
Where a kid's statements or beliefs or behaviors are even.
I always agree with my child. We never disagree about anything. They never make choices I don't like.
Yeah. That's amazing, Cari. We are all so happy
we're all
for
set.
you.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's all perfect.
How do we handle those kinds of situations? If my kid says something misogynistic.
Yeah. I know that actually happens in our local community sometimes because I think we definitely, I hope I'm saying this in a way that's fair to our listeners. I think I'm proud of our local community, statewide and particularly in Oak Park, of how hard people are working to try to raise conscientious kids, and that most people are trying to instill care in their kids. And I do know that we have some parents who've shared that there's a really scary, toxic part of our culture right now, particularly with social media, that I think is very attractive to young men in particular, that sort of red pill, toxic masculinity. And it's really scary when you're like trying to do everything right and your kiddo says something that's so not in your values. That comes up in our community. I think there's a reality that young people are trying different things on for size.
Yes.
I know part of normal adolescent development and part of my own development as a human, I can remember taking stances that were wildly opposed to my parents just because I could. I think processing your own feelings about that is important because it doesn't mean you're a failure. It actually doesn't necessarily mean that your child will always have that stance. But I think it's really important to get clear on your own values so you can stand in them when you are talking with your child.
Yeah, I think you can politely remind them that this is not something, a point of view that you support. I guess I would add to that listening is often the best antidote. And as a parent, making room for that, however hard it might be, while not compromising your own values or allowing that to be disrespected, we find that being curious about your kids' beliefs and ideas can help them to work through the various attractions of values that might be different from yours.
And if we're talking about statements and ideologies, I can't emphasize enough how impactful I believe social media is on young people who have access to it. And I often find the most productive conversations are asking the open-ended question, like, where did you come to this conclusion from? Because if you can hold space for them, you sometimes get a little closer to what I think is like the root, the behavior or the interest in. I think often for young boys, if we're talking about red pill culture, it is like a lack of safety and connection.
Yes.
And so sometimes the antidote is you being a safe person for your child or someone else's child to talk to. But I do want to draw the line of behavior because I think it's super scary when your child is acting out or behaving in ways that potentially have negative consequences, and that being sex positive doesn't mean being boundaryless, and that I would openly share your boundaries, particularly with sexual behavior. We can't control our kids, but you don't have to be permissive, right? You can still have a conversation about what behavior is acceptable in your presence, what the consequences for behaviors that don't align with those. And it would be an ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. Being a sex positive parent does not mean pushing your kids into sex, right?
It doesn't mean, oh, it's fine, invite your boyfriend over, you can sleep with them in my house and I'm condoning it, right? That's not sex positive. That's just boundaryless.
Abdicating responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, by the way, if your kid wants to know about your own sexual history, a different kind of boundary, it's also consistent with sex positive parenting to say that is private.
I love that.
I do not want to share my personal sexual history with you.
Yeah.
That
I
can be
love
hard
that.
too.
The line where that sometimes is something I have to revisit is I've noticed young people in our community often have questions about your sexual identity and sexual orientation, and they're not asking for nefarious reasons. They're often asking with deep curiosity because they're trying to understand their place in the world. And I think it's okay to share openly your sexual orientation. I don't think there's anything damaging about identifying yourself, but I personally don't believe it's ever beneficial for young people to be in any way involved or have a lot of information about their parents' sexual behavior. That's not good boundaries for kids.
Yeah, I don't see that. Or I don't see how that would be helpful. Now, certain stories, right? Kids often love to hear about what it was like for their parents, or maybe an embarrassing story from your past can be really bonding, right? But in general, people don't want to hear about their parents. I know I don't.
No, most of us are going to be like, hard pass on that. Thank you. It is sometimes okay. I will sometimes do my friend, or I knew a person once who.
Good strategy.
Right? That's okay if you really want to share. Typically, I'm sharing those for a safety reason. Like, it'll come up for me if it's, sometimes this is a thing that I've heard happens to young people that might be my personal experience, but I don't need to disclose to the kids. But they just need the general idea. Any other tips we think we want to share about parenting conflict?
We have moved through different ages and stages and different issues that might come up. If you, dear listener, have other questions or experiences or dilemmas to share, please do send them in, and we'll try to address those in a future episode. So in your own life, what are some suggestions for ways to express your own sex positivity, Cari?
For me? So I'm a big fan of reading. I am a big old dork for all, I'd say in the past 5 years. There's been like an explosion in sex positive parenting books for all age ranges. It's super cool. If you're local to us, the Oak Park Public Library has a rainbow librarian who can find all kinds of books on all kinds of topics, ranging from literally just books about body diversity for young people, anatomy books, to much more comprehensive books that include sexual identity, sexual orientation. There's all kinds of cool graphic novels that touch on public health. There are so many excellent fiction and nonfiction books now. So you can go to your public library and ask. The Oak Park Owl website also has some reading lists and some excellent information with books. So that's the place that I visit. I'm also a really big fan of building community. I am a big fan of building out a community of other parents and tapping them for their perspectives, especially when there's conflict with my kid.
That can be so valuable. So many people are going through the same thing that you're going through.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anything you would add to that, Nina?
There are great websites to check out too. Sex Positive Families we recommend, and Scarletine is another great resource. And we will include more links in the episode notes.
Well, thank you for taking this journey with us on sex positive parenting, and we will hear from you next time. Thanks for spending time with us today. Don't forget, we would like to hear from you. What did you think of today's episode? What questions or thoughts do you have about sex and sexuality? We will share some questions and replies in a future episode. Please write to us at gasppod@gmail.com. That's GASPPOD@gmail.com.
And thanks also to our sponsor, Oak Park Our Whole Lives. Oak Park Owl delivers comprehensive, inclusive sexuality education to youth and families in the greater west side of the Chicagoland area. For more information, check out their website at www.opowl.org.
Take care of yourself and others. Talk to you soon.